To refuse to join an ideological community with a poisonous system does not consign you to lonely individualism, where it's you against the world, or you for the world, or you owning the world. Because you can have a community. And so behind me, I want to introduce some of my friends. They are my vital community. Men and women who ignored toxic ideologies in the main. I'll mention a couple of them who did brace into it. But these are men and women who form the members of my community. And I'm not concerned about whether or not they are my contemporaries in time. They are the people that I love. They experience the world. So let me introduce you to some. Over here is Socrates, and he basically asks questions of people to get people to think straight. A wonderful human being. There's Picasso, I've mentioned him before. He just went from one artistic thing to another. It's rather amazing that he once took a bicycle seat and made it into a very interesting piece of architecture. But he kept going all the way into his 90s, changing, creating, discovering, growing, living, laughing, playing, thinking. Wonderful man. And then there's, of course, Charles Darwin. I probably have more books about Darwin than any other person in my library, either about him or books that he wrote. He was marvelous. I recall that his father wanted him to be a lawyer or a minister, but Darwin wasn't interested in that. He was a student of nature. I wonder if anybody watching knows that he wrote 3 volumes on the barnacles of boats. He not only wrote The Origin of the Species and The Descent of Man, 2 volumes that greatly released people from poisonous ideologies and narcissism, and said, you belong to all of nature. There was a common ancestor way back there. So you're a relative to the mushroom and the bush, the tree and the bird. Get over that business of thinking you're the greatest. Darwin's last book that he worked on happened to be on worms. And he was talking about the importance of worms. I could talk about Darwin all day, but I'll move on. And then there's Bettelheim. I really love the man. He was an honest guy, a brutal teacher at times, but he taught me a great deal. And he was not constrained by being an ideologist in any way. He was a free man. Isaiah Berlin over here, a few people will know, lived in the 20th century, was a professor at a British, either Oxford or Cambridge, I'm not sure. But he was a great man. Now another person here that's a friend of mine is Feynman, Richard Feynman, one of the greatest physicists of the 20th century, and certainly the greatest teacher of physics in the 20th century. Now, I don't understand a lot about Feynman, but I just marvel at his life. He was a man who wanted to learn everything. He would go, when he was teaching in California at the Institute of Technology, he would go to the biology department and said, what have you learned lately? He wanted to just embrace all of knowledge. As does another man back here that I think very few people would know, Leo Szilard, S-Z-I-L-A-R-D. Leo Szilard was the one who cracked the code of uranium-238 and discovering the power of it. He is the man who went to Einstein, a friend of his, and said, we need to get President Roosevelt to understand that if the Germans create the atomic bomb before we do, we're going to lose the war and Hitler will control the planet Earth. And so he actually dictated to Einstein the letter that started the Manhattan Project. Leo Szilard would also go department to department, geology, chemistry, biology, astronomy, and he'd say, "What have you learned lately?" Because he was a fabulous man. And I love Leo Szilard, S-Z-I-L-A-R-D. He always had a suitcase packed so that he could go anywhere in the world to learn and to teach. He went to Los Alamos and helped on the atomic bomb process. By the way, when he visited Einstein, he explained that you could tap into energy equal mc squared by going to uranium-238, and Einstein said, "I never thought about making a bomb out of what resides in mass." An interesting man. Benjamin Franklin is also over here. He's one of my friends. He was a interesting guy. Showed with a kite and a wire how lightning was electricity. But he was also an inventor. He was a man who wrote about the weather. he invented a lot of mottos that are still existent in America. Over here are other people I love. Victor Hugo's down here. He wrote one book I didn't like, but most of the time you think in Les Miserables and several other novels, he was a free man in a tough time. And he wrote honestly, and he was contributed to the freedom of humankind. He was one of my brothers. Also over here is Fyodor Dostoyevski. And Dostoyevski was also a free man. He had been in prison. He stood in front of a firing squad, and then they stopped just to kid him, but he thought he was going to die. He was a free man. He only said one sentence that I know I don't like, and that was in the Grand Inquisitor in Brothers Karamazov, where he says, "If God is dead, there will be no values," and I don't agree with that. Also over here is Robert Penn Warren. I happen to like him a lot, American writer. He wrote poetry, and it's of a free nature. He wasn't constrained by a toxic ideology that he had to believe. Not at all. Robert Penn Warren was great. Also over here is Adam Smith. He's right here, I think. And Adam Smith, people think, well, he set down the gospel of the free market and capitalism. And they forget that he also wrote The Theory of Moral Virtues, because another major book where he was saying that we have to not just think making a profit, we also have to think love to our fellow citizens on the planet Earth. So I really like Adam Smith. I like what he said about capitalism, but if you don't read his Theory of Moral Sentiments, you're missing half of his message, that we need capitalism and we need, I don't like to use the word socialism, but we need to balance. One of my friends, one of my family members, Isaac Newton, is over here, and he made a great contribution in terms of mathematics and physics and understanding our world. Galileo is over here. Also, Isaac Newton, I will say that he must have been out in the sun too long in his latter years, or he drank some Kool-Aid, or was around Mercury too much, because he tried to systematize the Bible and make it into a coherent, cohesive unit, when it was written over hundreds of years by different people who had different thoughts. But he wanted to make everything into a belief system and the perfect ideology in his latter years. So I like the first half of Isaac Newton's life. Then I mentioned Freud. Freud also helped liberate humankind, just like Darwin had done, Copernicus, Galileo, Isaac Newton. Freud introduced a lot of free thoughts. Unfortunately, Freud had a tendency to try to make it into a belief system and an ideology. And again, quite unfortunately, many of the followers of Freud and psychoanalytic institutes have become fundamentalists, trying to go back to a perfect belief system and the absolute right ideology. This is nonsense. But Freud did contribute. Finally, Thomas Jefferson. He's over there, a little bust of Thomas Jefferson. But Thomas Jefferson wrote not only the Declaration of Independence, he contributed to the Constitution. He wrote the Constitution of the state of Virginia. And he was a man who just was interested in everything, in architecture, in building a university, the University of Virginia, in having in his home the books of the world, in gathering archaeological remnants from around the country, geological remnants, bones of mastodons. He was a man that tried to embrace knowledge. And he's one of my family members. He's one of my fathers in terms of thought. Now remember that these are my betters. And here I want you to focus real closely on what I'm saying. This is my intellectual community. But it's also people that I own, who I embrace because they kept working for the freedom of humanity. They were not constrained by some ideology of ethnic or religious or economic or political. None of those positive ideologies really gripped them. These were free human beings. And so they have contributed to me, and I'm very grateful for them. And what I learned is that as long as I do my best, there is no shame. That is all I can do. And what I do is respectable and enough. I'm a finite person, and I do my best, and that is it. End of story.